More news from the war in France. What, you don't think it's a war? Well, what would you call it? A series of unfortunate events? It is a war. Every day the same enemy attacks France for the same reason, using violence under a common flag of an enemy. The enemy, of course, is radical Islam. They have a name for their war. It's an Arabic word, jihad. It means holy war against infidels. That would be you and me, or anyone else who doesn't submit. That's what the word Islam itself means in Arabic. It means submission. The terrorists who murdered 12 journalists in Paris on Wednesday were cornered in a building on the outskirts of the city today. The police finally stormed it in a hail of gunfire, but of course, that's not the only battle in France. Yesterday, a policewoman was just murdered in cold blood on the street, just like Corporal Nathan Cirillo was murdered in Canada late last year. Just killed, and for the same reason, Islamic Jihad. So Wednesday it was journalists for publishing cartoons depicting the Muslim prophet Muhammad. Thursday it was a policewoman, and today it was a Jewish grocery store. 2 Muslim terrorists burst in, murdering people immediately and holding others hostage, demanding that France release the terrorists from Wednesday. Is this not a war? The jihadists know it is. They say it is. They are doing it. Whether or not you say it's a war is almost irrelevant because it is going on. That question isn't really even an IQ test. It's a test of your grasp of reality and how much effort you're putting into not noticing things. You have to work very, very hard at it these days to pretend that radical Islam is not at war with the West. I think that the French are starting to wake up to the fact that they're at war. It's been 70 years since France was at war on their own territory last. But there's enough national memory, I think, for Frenchmen to see the similarities between the Nazi occupation of France and the Islamist occupation of France. Both are explicitly anti-Semitic. Both vow a final solution to kill all the Jews. But of course, both only start with the Jews and will consume everyone. Both seek to impose an alien culture and values on France by force. Both are indiscriminate in their violence. In 1938, Nazis targeted Jewish shops for riots and arson in Germany in a night called Kristallnacht, meaning Night of the Broken Glass. Today in Paris, after the grocery store attack, French police ordered every Jewish shop in the predominantly Jewish neighborhoods closed. That's a bit like what happened with the cartoons, wasn't it? 3 terrorists attack a magazine for publishing images of Muhammad. And then almost every Western newspaper, certainly those in North America, voluntarily comply by not publishing images of Muhammad, even as they pretend to cover the news of the images of Muhammad. So 2 terrorists today attack a Jewish shop. And so the Parisian police assist, not by pouring soldiers into the streets to defend those shops, but by doing what the terrorists seek, closing every other Jewish shop. The difference, of course, is that the Nazi invasion of France was done by German soldiers in uniform, entering violently in tanks and airplanes. The current jihadist war on France is done by terrorists who were either born in France or who were let in by France through massive immigration. For most of their occupation of France, the German army had barely 250,000 troops in the country. It was used as a rest and relaxation rotation for their German troops from tougher theaters of war. 250,000 Germans. Credible estimates put the Muslim population in France at up to 10 million. Let's say 90% of those Muslims are against violence. The polls show that as being naively generous. That's still 1 million who support it. And even if 90% of them are passive supporters of the jihad, that still leaves 100,000 people. We know that France is the source of more than 1,000 terrorist fighters in the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. And of course, we've just seen what only 5 terrorists can do in a mighty nation of the French nation of 66 million people, a nuclear-armed nation, a NATO nation, the nation of Napoleon. Look at what 5 terrorists have done. Are you surprised that last year 6,000 Jews left France, many of them going to Israel? I'm surprised that the number's so low. But why would French Jews go to Israel? I mean, why Israel? Don't they know that Israel is surrounded by terrorists too? Don't they know that Israel has been invaded by its Muslim neighbors 5 times since 1948 and is under threat of nuclear annihilation from Iran and rocket attacks from Gaza? Well, yes, of course those French Jews know that. We all know that. And yet Israel is safer And I'll tell you why it's safer than France. A moment ago, I said it's almost entirely irrelevant whether or not you think this is war in France because the enemy knows it's war. A war is happening. I said almost irrelevant, but it is relevant for one important reason. If you are willfully blind to the war against you, if you are in denial, then you will not take steps to defend yourself, let alone to fight back. You see, that's a key difference between France and Israel. Israel is besieged, it is surrounded, but it has one big advantage over the West. It has moved through the denial stage. No one in Israel, not even the far left, pretends that there is no jihad. No one in Israel talks about terrorist attacks being just lone wolves. No one in Israel, not even the left-wing media, starts their news coverage of any Muslim terrorist attack by denying that the Muslim was really Muslim or denying that the terrorism was really terrorism. They don't go on about terrorists being mentally ill or crazy. They don't talk about lone wolves. They don't move immediately to blaming the victim. Oh, we provoked them. Oh, they deserved murder at the French magazine because they published an image of Mohammed. Oh, she deserved to be raped because she wore a skirt. They don't do that. They're not in denial. And that one fact makes Israel safer. And after the break, I'll show you how they take terrorism seriously. So 6,000 Jews moved from France to Israel for safety last year alone. Are you surprised? I'm not. They're not fools when it comes to terrorism in Israel. They understand it is rooted in radical Islam. It's propagated from radical mosques, not just whipped up in the mosques, but the mosques themselves are where rockets are fired against Israel from. Here's a mosque in Gaza with a rocket launcher next to it that Israel hit in the recent war. Not just mosques, schools too. On several occasions during the last war between Hamas terrorists and Israel, rockets were found literally in schools run by the UN. And the UN promptly handed the rockets over to Hamas. So there's not a lot of willful blindness in Israel anymore about the jihad. There's not a lot of denial. And after countless attempts to find a peace deal, all of which have failed except for the one permanent peace with Egypt that Israel paid for by giving up the entire Sinai Desert, after Israel offered everything to the Palestinian terrorists again and again, only to be rejected again and again, there really isn't a lot of naivete that the war can be ended through negotiation. So Israel is ahead of the West in two ways. They know it's a war, and they know it can't be bargained away through appeasing terrorists. You see how Israel would be safer than France? Oh, and by the way, there are about 1.5 million Arabs in Israel proper, about 20%. In France, the official number is about 6 million Muslims, but in reality, the number is likely 10 million, or about 15%. France is as Muslim as Israel is, but with 10 million souls, not 1.5 million. Now let's stop for a moment and go through our list of courses. Of course, most Muslims aren't violent. Of course, most Muslims want to live peacefully. And let's say, without evidence, but just to be charitable, that most Muslims want to be free. A Western concept that has few roots in the Arab world, a world without a single real democracy, unless you call civil war-torn Iraq or Lebanon a democracy, or maybe the Kingdom of Morocco or the authoritarian Turkish country. But let's be kind. It's true. Many Muslims want to be Western. That's one reason to go to the West. Another, though, is easy welfare, and 40% of French Muslim youth are unemployed. Another reason, of course, is to wage jihad. That is a reason to go west, to join the jihad. But not all Muslims are that way. Even in Israel, a poll of Israeli Arabs just out last week showed that 65% of Israeli Arabs are either quite proud or very proud of being Israeli. Not much less so than the 86% of Israeli Jews who say the same thing. Most Israeli Arabs actually trust the Israeli army, incredibly. Israeli Arabs have full citizenship. Indeed, Arabs are permitted to join the army, but not required to. Arabs sit in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, and even serve on Israel's Supreme Court. There is a coexistence there, but it is based on the reality that a large number of Muslims and Arabs want to kill them. My point is, Israel is safer than France for Jews because in Israel they do not fool themselves. So they protect themselves through a strong army and national security and surveillance and intelligence, but also in other ways. Ordinary Israelis are allowed to bear arms. Soldiers are allowed to take their guns home with them off duty, so they're protected. Compare that to France, again, which proudly enforces gun control against its own citizens, rendering them impotent. Even the policemen guarding the magazine's office on Wednesday were unarmed. Like I say, it is a nation in denial. I'm a pessimist these days. I keep thinking of those lines from Yeats' poem, The Second Coming. These lines, I know I've read them to you before. Let me try again here. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. You should read the whole poem. Lots of reasons to be pessimistic, but I think that for a lot of Frenchmen, this week's open warfare against them was a wake-up call that will not be ignored. I think they will realize they are at war, a war from within, a war waged by an enemy just as evil and just as ambitious as the Nazis were, if limited by their abilities so far, but we'll see. There was lots of fake courage too, though, like those Associated Press journalists in Paris holding up signs saying, "Je suis Charlie," as in they were just like Charlie Hebdo, the magazine that was attacked on Wednesday. That's in Paris there. That's a lie, though, because if they were like Charlie, they would have shown the actual cartoons, which they did not and will not. This is their fake courage. There were some rallies, too, massive ones. In fact, like this one, in support of Charlie Hebdo, the massacred magazine. Not a lot of headscarves in the crowd, I'm afraid, but can't help but notice that. It was called a National Unity Rally. But what does that mean? Unity with whom? Unity with unassimilated immigrants who believe in un-French values? Unity with radical mosques and imams preaching the jihad? Unity with those who propose Sharia law, like banning depicting Mohammed? Unity with whom? Surely not with the massacred journalists. And that unity rally reportedly banned from it France's leading politician, not the president of France, but a woman named Marine Le Pen, head of the Front National party that she inherited from her father, the late Jean-Marie Le Pen. Her father could credibly be called an anti-Semite and a xenophobe. Marine Le Pen has renounced anti-Semitism and has focused on immigration. Of course, she is still denounced as racist and far-right by the establishment media, and I honestly don't know enough about her to give her a clean bill of health, though I know that whenever the mainstream media condemns someone as far-right, it's typically because they have no real ammunition against them, other than they disagree with them. But here's the thing, Marine Le Pen was specifically included, the most popular politician excluded. So much for the unity rally, but why? Why was she excluded? And why is she leading the polls in France? And why is Nigel Farage's UK Independence Party, equally tough on unlimited, unfiltered immigration, doing so well in British polls? And why are tens of thousands of German liberals marching against radical Islam in the streets there? Because they have stopped being willfully blind. And yet when they express genuine concern and fear of the jihad, they're called racist and shamed for being afraid. They are driven out of the establishment parties because the establishment parties told them to shut up. They didn't want to come to terms with the fact that the multicultural dream in France has turned into a nightmare. The jihadists were not integrating. They were colonizing. That the great French ideals, the great European ideals, ideals that could fairly be called the great Christian Enlightenment ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, the ideals of the French Revolution were not shared by those who put Sharia law ahead of secular law. And they weren't becoming Frenchmen in spirit, but rather France's former colonies were now coming to the mother country itself to colonize France. Look at this clip. This is from a very popular François Hollande campaign ad from the 2012 election. This went viral on YouTube. If you're François Hollande, the left-wing president of France, and you get this kind of love from the banlieues, the Muslim neighborhoods, are you going to talk to anyone who says something against unlimited, unfiltered immigration? Are you going to talk to someone who is worried about Sharia law? Listen to the clip of the lady in this video saying, François Hollande, Inshallah. Inshallah means it's the will of Allah. Take a listen.
Il faut mettre quelqu'un dedans. Gold bottles, soul models, spilling ace on my sick days. Also hard behave, just might let me gay. Shot top, moving the next BK. Also hard find me.
Bon courage François Hollande, on est tous avec toi. T'as tout créé, tout le monde est là.
Also hard find me. That shit great.
The Kanye West song and Jay-Z. Sorry, it's not working though. This is not an anti-immigrant screed. It is an anti-jihadist screed. I am against the jihad. I'm not Muslim, and I do not want to be forced to live as a Muslim, whether it's being told what I can draw or publish or anything else in my life. And if you're anti-jihad as I am, then you look to where the jihad is coming from. It's coming from, in large part, massive immigration of people who believe in the Quran more than they believe in Western constitutions. And it's coming from our own domestic mosques, where they teach not only Islam on a personal basis, but as a political force for subjugating the entire West. Or do you still deny that? Do you think this is all unrelated to Islam? The hostage taker in Sydney, Australia, the murder of Corporal Nathan Cirillo and Warrant Officer Patrice Vincent in Canada, the storming of our parliament, the attack on Charlie Hebdo in Paris, the murder of the French policewoman, the attack on the Jewish grocery store today. Do you think it's all unrelated to the jihad? Are you still in denial? I don't know if France still is. I know Israel isn't, which is the key to their safety and survival. And I think the key to the happiness of most of the peaceful Muslims who live in Israel. But after the break, I'll tell you about the country I care most about, Canada. More Source still ahead. Before the break, I told you about the war against France. It's a jihad. It's being waged both by radical Muslim immigrants to France and by Muslims born in France, radicalized in French mosques, some of whom have training or terrorist experience in countries like Yemen or Iraq or Syria. It's a Muslim war. Not all Muslims are in it, just like not all Germans were Nazis. But that's the trick used by the willfully blind, by the politically correct. That's why millions of French voters are for Marine Le Pen. Some of them were pulled to her, sure, but many more were pushed to her. Pushed because if they dared to express concern about the jihad, they were called racist, or told to shut up, or told that there were just too many votes to be had. You saw that Francois Hollande video and the woman saying, Inshallah. Islamophobia, the fear of Islam. Are you not afraid of Islam after what happened in Paris? Not of every Muslim, but of the ideology that motivates and inspires and instructs all of these terrorist attacks. And don't tell me, as so many liberal white denialists do, that it's not the real Islam. It's real enough for tens of millions, probably hundreds of millions of Muslims who believe it. Islamophobia, the fear of Islam. If you're not afraid by what you've seen on TV, then you are in denial. There is a legitimate form of Islamophobia, being afraid of the jihad. That's the purpose of the jihad, by the way, to make you afraid so that you comply with them, so that you submit to them. That's what terrorism is meant to do, to terrify you into compliance. Millions of people in France and the West are terrified, but don't want to submit or comply. They want to fight back. You know, a lot of Frenchmen were terrified of the Nazis too. Most were. Some just put their head down and were silent in their submission during the occupation. Some collaborated with the Nazis, the Vichy regime. They were French allies of the Nazis, a puppet government that officially ran France for the Nazis. Those were collaborators. Some did it out of ambition, some out of evil, but many just did it out of fear. And then there were those who were afraid of Nazism, who became French freedom fighters, partisans who waged a constant campaign of military harassment against the Nazis. And there were French who fled France to fight as foreign-based expats to liberate France with Charles de Gaulle. Same thing here. There are plenty of things to do with your fear. Silence or denial is one thing. Collaboration and submission to the terrorists is another. Fighting back is a third. None of these require you to deny being afraid. But that's the thing about Islamophobia, fear of Islam. Political correctness has told anyone who is afraid that they ought to be ashamed of their fear, that it's just prejudice and stereotyping and racism and illegitimate. So they're pushed to those who don't condemn them for their real fears. UKIP, the Front National. In Israel, everyone's afraid. But they're not letting that fear dominate their lives. Israel has a booming economy, strong national confidence, a strong, watchful military, and the most interesting sign of national confidence, a high birth rate in Israel. They believe in the future, a future for their children to be safe and happy. They're managing their fear in Israel. They're not losing their marbles. So what about here in Canada? How are we handling our fear? What are our leaders doing? Our media leaders have failed. Some are silent, but most have submitted. They're just plain collapsing and doing the bidding of the terrorists. I showed you the disgraceful clips from David Studer, the CBC executive sent out to explain why the CBC will not show images of Mohammed at all, even natural images, any depiction at all.
Well, we start from the principle that we are a responsible news organization. Part of our job as Canada's national broadcaster is to promote tolerance and respect, and to recognize that unlike some other religions, in this case, some other religions where you see statues and you see pictures of deities, it's one of the tenets of Islam that the Prophet not be depicted in pictures or cartoons.
Do you think he believes a word he's saying? To promote tolerance, respect. That's the purpose of the CBC News. Not to show the news, but to promote tolerance. And did you hear what he called Muhammad? He called him the Prophet. Not Islam's prophet, just the Prophet, like calling Jesus Lord Jesus, or calling the Christian Bible the Holy Bible. He's using the language of Islamic submission. Look, buddy, you look scared. Your body language shouts that you don't believe a word that you're saying, but you have to say something. It is your job at CBC News. No one says you have to be brave. But you have to be a journalist if you work for a news agency. If not, why don't you find a less stressful job that doesn't require you to show the real news? Here's more from Studer.
There will be others who will say, you know what, you're making a choice, you're being more sensitive to people's freedom of religion or religious sensibilities than you are to other people who really believe in freedom of expression and freedom of the press, and are offended that we would make that decision.
Yeah, and I think that argument's got a hole in it, because I think, as I say, nothing particularly important turns on seeing these things. That they exist, like I've seen them, you know, anyone who wants to go online can see them. You don't learn much from seeing them beyond the fact that there are cartoons they're cartoons that some people might find funny, some others might find offensive. And I think our job is to stand back from that and say, look, they're there, they happened, this provoked this response, but we wouldn't have shown them the day before. Just because these gunmen did what they did isn't going to provoke us into it.
So nothing important turns on seeing the news, people. He's seen the cartoons for you. That's good enough, isn't it? You trust him to tell you what is or isn't important to you, don't you? He's helping protect you, you dainty little know-nothing. Let him do the thinking for you. That's called censorship, by the way. He's censoring things. Did you hear his language? The cartoon provoked violence. They had it coming, like a rape victim who wore a skirt. He used the word provoke twice, actually. The CBC won't be provoked into showing the news. Oh, it's a game, a chicken, is it? They won't be provoked into showing the biggest news of the season. They're called a news station. Of course, about 10 seconds on the CBC's website, you can find this. It's an image of a Christian crucifix submerged in urine. In case you missed the point of it, it is to offend Christians. It's art by Andres Serrano. He called this art Piss Christ. That's the name of this installation, just in case you missed it. So that's important for the CBC to show. That's on their website. We showed it. They had a show about it. That's important news. That's essential to show. And you know what? It actually was news. But only one group cannot be offended by real news. David Studer is so scared he's probably wearing Depends to work. That's fine, David. You're clearly not built for conflict. So why don't you switch to another department of the CBC, like weather or sports? As you can see, I'm focusing on David Studer, a CBC employee. I don't know him. I don't have a clue what he personally thinks about all this or whether he even holds any strong feelings on the subject. I only listen to what he says as a CBC official and watch how he says it. That's it. And it's pitiful. Over at the CBC, they've got Islamophobia big time. Fear of Islam. But they're afraid to admit it, so they're making up other weirder, laughable excuses for their cowardly conduct. Oh, it's not just Studer. Don't let me pick on the CBC alone. Here's John Cruikshank, the publisher of the Toronto Star, who had an amazing interview on the radio yesterday where he went through about 5 different alibis for why they didn't show the cartoons. I won't play the whole thing. It was 10 minutes of glorious acrobatics. I haven't seen such fancy footwork since Riverdance came to town. It was like a watermelon seed. You know, you press down from the right, it squirts to the left. You press down from the left, it squirts to the right, because none of it was true. He was afraid, and he wouldn't dare admit it, sort of. You know, here's a minute of his different versions where he sort of admits it.
Perhaps about a similar backlash here. You're worried about what Nick was talking about, that issue of offense. Is that fair?
No, not at all.
I mean, how much of that decision, though, was based around the possibility that you would offend people?
Oh, offend people? There's certainly an element of that. Not out of fear, but out of a genuine concern. I think, frankly, you know, Muslim Canadians, Muslims in North America, have had lots of education in being humiliated. Most non-whites have had lots of education in being humiliated in our society. We don't offend in that way.
This doesn't even make any sense. Look, I'm not mad at Cruikshank or Studer for their Islamophobia, their fear of Islam. I share their fear of Islam. I just think they're speaking under duress now. They're publishing and broadcasting under duress. It's like someone in a hostage situation. You can't actually trust what they say because they will say anything to stay alive. We can't trust them on their news judgment on the cartoons. But how about anything else related to this? How about on immigration, on Islam, on national security? If they are so compromised by their fear of the cartoons, how about on everything else? Perhaps we should take Studer's advice and just go to the internet to find out the news ourselves instead of watching what he thinks we need to see in the name of sensitivity. Is there any hope for Canada? I'll tell you after the break. Before the break, I told you about Canada's cowardly media party caving into the terrorist wishes. Can we even trust them with their news judgment anymore? So much for our media leaders, our brave, independent champions of free speech. But thank God we have a real prime minister built for these times. Here's Stephen Harper yesterday.
When a trio of hooded men struck at some of our most cherished democratic principles, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, they assaulted democracy everywhere. Yesterday, hundreds of thousands of people around the world, in cities across this country, openly demonstrated that we will not be intimidated by jihadist terrorists.
Strong stuff, saying the word jihad. That's naming it by its name. That's not calling it just terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. Jihad is the mission, the strategy, the motivation. It's the difference between calling the attack on Pearl Harbor a problem with airplanes or torpedoes or a problem with the Empire of Japan. One is a tactic. The other is the enemy. Here's more from Harper.
They have declared war on anybody who does not think and act exactly as they wish they would think and act. They have declared war and already are executing it on a massive scale on a whole range of countries with which they are in contact. And they have declared war on any country like ourselves that values freedom, openness, and tolerance.
It's very clear. And he was talking about war, and by they he meant jihad. He said it before. You know, the word jihad, which means holy war, was officially banned by the RCMP in its recently published handbook on how to talk about terrorism. You'll note that the CBC never uses the word jihad either, just like they don't say the word terrorism. Barack Obama, of course, never says that word either. Even saying jihad is a huge step forward because it acknowledges two things. Number one, that there is a war, and number two, that the war is motivated by radical Islam. Just before this attack in Paris, by coincidence, Harper changed his national security advisor to Richard Fadden, former Deputy Minister of Defense, former director of CSIS. Fadden has long said that we are in denial about radical Islam. He has lamented how, in fact, the popular culture treats terrorists like Omar Khadr as folk heroes. He is, what's the word? An Islamo-realist. Islamo-realist. That's Harper speaking plainly, hiring clear-eyed advisors. Harper has gone out of his way to court relationships with moderate Muslim groups. He conspicuously visits liberal mosques like Ismaili mosques and Ahmadiyya mosques. He has Muslim staff himself. He's no racist, and he's not a cowardly Islamophobe hiding his fear of Islam or submitting to his fear. Harper wants to fight back. I hope he will, because as a Canadian and frankly as a Jew, I don't want to lose Canada, our country, the best country in the world, the way the French are at risk of losing theirs.